It is with great pleasure that I meet you in this discussion for social sciences history. We are going to do a memorandum discussion for a paper for history for the end of year examinations. So as usual, we understand that our paper for social sciences history for November exams, it comprises of 75 marks. And out of those 75 marks, we understand that part of the questions, they will be from term 3 content, and part of the questions also will be for the final term, which is term 4. So we are going to go through this set of questions, and we are going to discuss and come out with the relevant responses to the given questions. Right, without wasting much time, we are going to go through the questions. Right. Our first question, which is question number 1 in section A, is a question based on the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Right, it says, use source 1A and your own knowledge to answer the following questions. Source 1A is a picture of the Berlin Conference in 1884 to decide how to divide Africa between leading European powers. Right, so we are seeing there the Berlin Conference is indicated, and we want to analyze the questions and also to answer the questions. The first question is saying, what was the name of the conference held by European powers to discuss partitioning of Africa? What was the name of the conference held by European powers to partition Africa? So the name of the conference, as indicated on the source, it was called the Berlin Conference. That was the name of the conference that was held, where European powers came to discuss about the partitioning of Africa. Right, then the next question is saying, what is the name of the prime minister shown holding a knife in source 1A? What is the name of the prime minister shown holding a knife in source 1A? We are referring to this figure here. What is the name of that very prime minister who is holding a knife? Right, that prime minister was known as Otto von Bismarck. He was called Otto von Bismarck. And we understand he was the Prime Minister of Germany. He was the Prime Minister of Germany, and his name was Otto von Bismarck. So apparently we are saying he is the one who spearheaded the Berlin Conference. He is ultimately the one who called for the conference to discuss about the partitioning of Africa. Then number 1.1.3 says, explain in one sentence what was this conference in Berlin, what this conference in Berlin was about. Why did they gather? What did they want to discuss? What was the motive of them calling for that particular conference? That is what the question is requiring us to indicate. So the main purpose of the conference was to decide how to divide Africa between leading European powers. So they actually got that so that they would decide on how to divide Africa. Remember the idea here of gathering, they wanted to avoid instances of them fighting amongst themselves. Because of the issue of scramble of Africa, countries were rushing to get colonies in Africa. So there was high chances that they were going to clash over some other territories. So they wanted to devise a systematic way of partitioning Africa, of dividing Africa amongst themselves. So that was the main purpose why they called for that particular conference. They wanted to decide how to divide Africa between the leading European powers. Then the next question is saying, explain why Africans thought that what happened at this conference was unfair. As an African, from the perspective of Africans, they viewed the Berlin Conference as an unfair gathering that was done in Europe. Why did they say it was unfair? For the very same reason that Africans were not invited. The gathering was about Africa, but there was no African representative in the conference. So for that same reason, how would they decide about the future of Africa without involving the very same Africans over whom they are discussing about? So it shows that it was actually a very unfair gathering to discuss about the destiny of Africa in the offices in Europe without any African representative. So Africans would regard that as an unfair gathering. And also, what was the gathering about? We could also argue that they wanted to discuss about colonization of Africa, which later on brought so much losses. On Africans. The discussion was all about deciding on how to colonize Africa. And we know the results of colonization, that Africans got to lose so much of their wealth, so much of their resources, their independence, their freedom, their sovereignty. They lost all those because of this conference here. So it was unfair for European nations to gather to discuss about the destiny of Africa in terms of deciding on finding ways of how to partition Africa amongst themselves at the expense of Africans. Africans later on lost what they were having in their possession because of the coming of the Europeans. So ultimately we can say the gathering of the Berlin Conference was a very unfair gathering because it was meant to plan about colonization, which later on brought with itself a very negative results on the African continent. So it was an unfair gathering. Right. We move on to the next question. Next question is talking about the patterns of colonization. Ultimately, we are saying, when we're looking at the patterns, we are saying which country colonized which part of Africa. Right, so it's a map showing the pattern of colonization. Right, then the first question is saying, what is colonization? The concept colonization. When you're defining, you can define it in your own understanding. We do not have a fixed definition. You can define it according to your own understanding. But as long as you address the key concept of the idea of colonization, then your response will be regarded as correct. So I will give this as the response. My definition will say colonization, it involves taking control of land. And people living on it. Usually by force. That is how I can define colonization by saying the process of colonization, it involves taking control of land and people living on the land, usually using forceful means. That's the idea of colonization. We are saying there is a country which is powerful, and the country, because of its political power and its economic power, it can dominate over a weaker country to take control of its land and also to try and take control of its very own people. And for that reason, we are saying That's the idea of colonization. One country which is powerful, it is managing to take control of land and also taking control of the people living on that particular land. And they do it using forceful means in most of the instances. That is the process of colonization. Right, then moving on to the next question, it says, which European power colonized most of the African countries? Which European power colonized most of the African countries? You can figure it out from the pattern of colonization here. If you were to analyze the pattern here, we see that the dominant color, which is prevailing over most of African states, is this red color here. If you see, this is South Africa here, and also we see this is Zimbabwe, and we see this is Botswana, and we see also all these countries in red, now independent, but they were taken control by one colonial master. And if you check also here, it's red. If you also check here, it's also the same code. Here also the same color code here. So throughout, if you see, the red dominated. And if you go to our key, the red is for the Great Britain. So it means the country which managed to colonize most of the African countries was the Great Britain. It is the Great Britain which had got the chance to take the biggest portion of African countries. And then the next question is saying, what are these countries the Europeans took over called? These countries that have been taken over by European countries, they are African countries, but now they are being dominated by European powers. What do we call those countries whose control now was determined by European powerful countries? We call them the colonies. They are called the colonies. We are looking at colonization. Colonization, when the country is taken, it becomes a colony, and the controlling country becomes the colonial master. So we have the European country, it becomes a colonial master, and the country which has been colonized becomes a colony. For example, South Africa was colonized by the British. So we say South Africa was a colony of the British, and the British were the colonial masters of South Africa. Right. Number 124, find the Gold Coast on the map and answer the following questions. The Gold Coast, we know that the Gold Coast is now the present country of Ghana. So from the map, you can figure out where the Gold Coast is. And then the question is saying, which European country colonized this African country? We understand that when we look at the Ashanti Kingdom was a kingdom in the Gold Coast. And the Gold Coast was a name that was given by the British. So the European country was Britain. It is the British that were able to take control of the Gold Coast, and they renamed it into the Gold Coast. Then it says, how did this country acquire its colonial name? The name is the Gold Coast. How did they come out to give the country a name of the Gold Coast? The Ashanti was renamed the Gold Coast. Why? Gold, it meant, for the sake of gold, it had vast gold reserves. It was rich in gold. Why they chose to call it the Gold Coast is because the gold part came from the fact that the country was rich in gold. And the fact of the cost. What is a cost in this instance? We are saying it's Gold Coast. So it meant the part of gold was coming from the fact that it was rich in gold, and the coast part, we are saying it was near the coast. It is near the coast. It's a coastal country. Remember, when you're talking of coastal country, we are saying it's a country that borders with water, borders with the sea. Like South Africa, it's a coastal country because it borders with both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So for that reason, it's a coastal country. So the same as the Ashanti Kingdom, it is also a coastal country. So for that reason, it being a coastal country and it being having riches in terms of gold resources, then they combine the two ideas to come out with the colonial name of the Gold Coast. Right. Taking it to the next question, mention 3 reasons why European powers were able to colonize Africa so quickly. You are supposed to be specific in answering this question. It's not a general question, or it's not a general question whereby you give reasons for the colonization of Africa. We are worried about the pace of colonization. Why did European countries were in a position to colonize Africa so quickly? They did not take much time. What was it that they had, and what was it that was in Africa or among East African societies that made the process to be fast? It was a fast process. Right. So we can look at European powers have got powerful weapons, powerful advanced weapons. Like, for example, talk of the machine gun. Because of such inventions of these advanced weapons, they were able to effectively fight against resistance by African societies. So for that reason, they were able to colonize Africa so quickly because they had an upper hand in terms of invading African societies and manipulating and taking control of them. So because of the weapons that they had, they were able to colonize Africa so quickly. And also we can say it was also because of rivalry amongst African leaders. African leaders were not united by then, and it gave the Europeans an advantage to take control. They were not having a united front in the fight against colonization. They could not unite with each other to fight against the invasion by the whites. So for that reason, they were having their own disputes and their own infightings. So the Europeans, they took advantage of such to quickly colonize the African continent, because it was not united. The leaders were fighting amongst themselves, and hence it gave an upper hand to the Europeans. And also we can look at the issue of natural disasters. For example, droughts. They weakened the African societies. Africans were very weak. They were weakened by natural disasters. And for that reason, the Europeans were able to effectively colonize. If you are weakened by a disaster, it means you cannot effectively fight against invasion by the enemy. So the Europeans, they took advantage that that Africans were weakened by the prevalence of natural disasters like droughts, and they were able to effectively come and colonize Africa as quick as was possible. Then we can also look at other ideas like the work of missionaries. The work of missionaries, they were also very effective in speeding up the ideas of colonialism. They helped very well in the process of colonization by Europeans because they had the knowledge about Africa. They had earlier on visited Africa and they were well aware of the lives of Africans, which made it very easy for Europeans to infiltrate and get to control the African societies. Right, those are some of the ideas that you can use We take it to the next question. The next question is question number 2, which is based on the results of colonization. Use the source 2A and 2B below in your own knowledge to answer the questions that follow. Right. When you're looking at source 2A, it's an extract from a biography of an African leader that sums up what happened because of colonization. Right. It says, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. That was a biography by Desmond Tutu, Archbishop. Right. So if you're seeing there, the impression of the source is that Africans were tricked. They were tricked using the Bible through the missionaries. When the missionaries came, they came head forward with the Bible. They came with the idea of spreading their beliefs to Africans. Remember, they were calling Africans to be in a dark continent. Africa was regarded as a dark continent. And for the same reason, they wanted to bring in light to Africa, which was being brought in the ideas of their beliefs, which were Christian beliefs. So for that same reason, they fooled us into prayer. And when the prayer was over, we realized that we had exchanged. They took over the land. They gave us the Bible. That's the idea of what happened according to the understanding of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Then we go on to source 2B. Source 2B saying it's a comment on colonialism from the Prime Minister, Sisi John Rhodes of Zimbabwe, which is now Zimbabwe, during the white minority rule. Right. What did he say? He said, I would say colonialism is a wonderful thing. It spread civilization to Africa. Before, they had no written languages, no will as we know it, no schools, no hospitals, not even normal clothing. That's the idea of colonization according to the perspective of the colonialists. So the first question is saying, read source 2A and explain what point of view does it have on colonization. Right, when the question is saying point of view, we are saying what's the impression of the person who gave us that view? How did they see colonization? So if we check here, the impression is that colonization had a negative impression. He has a negative view on colonization. It's a negative view. People bring forward with them the Bible, and then at the end, they give us the Bible, they take the land. So it's a negative view. Colonization is bad. Our land was taken. And if we also check, we can also say Africans were robbed. The perspective is that Africans were robbed. They got the Bible. At the expense of their land. That is the other perspective. We are seeing here that the idea of the exchange of the Bible with land is a very unfair exchange, which cannot happen under normal conditions, under normal situations. No one can exchange a Bible for land. So we are saying Africans were tricked or they were robbed. They got the Bible at the expense of their land. They remained with Christianity beliefs, but their land was taken. So that's the perspective of the first. And then the point of view of the next source, of source 2B, what's the point of view of source 2B here? The point of view is a positive one. If you check there, positive view. Why are we saying it's a positive point of view? He's saying colonialism was wonderful. How wonderful was it? They are saying colonialism was a wonderful thing. And also it brought a lot of good things to Africa. It brought good to Africa. What good did it bring? It says it spread civilization. And there were no written languages in Africa. There were no wheels, meaning to say we didn't have modern forms of transportation. There were no schools, no hospitals, and not even normal clothing. So it meant that all those things that were not there were brought because of colonialism. So the perspective there is positive about colonialism. They are supporting colonialism. They are saying it was ultimately a very good thing for the Africans because they got to be civilized. They got to engage in written languages. They got to engage in the wheel, which is the modern forms of transportation. And they also got to have schools. They also got to have hospitals. And they got normal clothing. So it's a positive perspective. It's positive about colonialism. Then the question says, number 2.3, explain why the views in source 2A and source 2B are so different. The question is not asking you to give the differences in the perspective because already you've given the difference. The question is why is that the perspectives are different? Why is it that the perspectives are different? These perspectives are from different people. They are different because they are from different people. The way they view colonialism, it was different because they were coming from different backgrounds. The first one is by an African. Source A is by an African. The perspective of colonialism by Africans, they perceive it as negative because they were robbed, they lost their land. They did not like colonialism. It was ultimately a way of robbing them of their resources at the expense of bringing in Christianity. So the perspective of source A is of an African person. They were not happy with colonialism. Then the perspective of source B is of a European. The Europeans, we know that they benefited from colonialism. So that is why they are supporting it. They are giving it as a positive perspective. Their view of colonialism is positive because they benefited from colonialism. It was advantageous to their side. They were happy with it. So for the reason that the perspectives, for the reason that the background of the people giving their views are different, it also implies that their understanding of the idea of colonialism also tends to differ. So the main reason there is those views are from different people. The source A is an African person. Africans felt like they were robbed of their resources. Then the perspective of source B is of a European. They benefited from colonialism and hence they support the idea of colonialism. Right. Then the next question is saying, number 2.4, Africa lost so many things after colonization. Africa lost so many things after colonization. Mention 3 results of colonization. Mention 3 results of colonization. The results of colonization, we want the negative results here because it's saying Africa lost. We cannot talk about positives. We look at the negatives. It's a loss to Africa. So predominantly, Africa lost its land. Africa lost its resources. For example, minerals. They were lost to colonialists. We look at other ideas of Africans being enslaved. Africans had to work, were forced to work for a wage or even enslaved. In some instances, they were enslaved, which was negative. Africans lost their independence. Africans lost their freedom. They lost because of artificial borders, which were imposed, which meant that African societies could no longer interrelate like what they used to do before the coming of colonists. When the colonists came, they came with the idea of artificial borders, which barred people from moving around freely. So it was a loss on the African society. So when you're looking at this question, we look at it from the perspective of losses that were incurred on the side of Africa. On the side of Africa. Right. Then we move on to question number 3. Question number 3 is the Ashanti Kingdom. It's a case study. Source 3A shows how the Ashanti resisted British attempts to colonize the Gold Coast. It is taken from General History of Africa, 7 Africa, under colonial domination, 1880 to 1935. Right. There is the source. You're supposed to go through the source and try to figure out the information in the source. You're not going to go through the source. It's a long source. Right? So from here, we need to go to the questions. In which year did the Ashanti Kingdom defeat the British Army? This is an extraction question. You go to the source and you figure out. Like if you come to the second sentence, it says, this started in the 1760s and culminated in the military engagement in 1824, in which the Ashanti forces defeated the British forces. So it was in 1824 when the British forces were defeated by the Ashanti Kingdom. That was 1824. Right. Then the next question says, at which battle did the British defeat the Ashanti? At which battle? The statement continues, defeated the British forces and their allies and killed their commander, Sir Charles McCarthy, the then governor of the Gold Coast. 2 years later, the British revenged this defeat at the Battle of the Door. So, it being a revenge, they were revenging the defeat, which means the British were able also to defend themselves and defeat the Ashanti at the Battle of the Door. Right? Name the leader of the British Army during the Ashanti defeat. Who was the leader of the British Army during the Ashanti defeat? Right. You're supposed to figure out from the given text and find out who was their leader during the time of the defeat of the British. It says, in 1850 and 1863, war was narrowly averted but between 1869 to 1872, the Ashanti virtually attacked and occupied all the southern and coastal areas of the Gold Coast. To beat back the Ashanti, the British government launched one of the best organized campaigns of the period under the command of one of the most famous British officers, Governor Kenneth Wolseley. Governor Kenneth Wolseley. So that was the name of the leader of the British Army by the time they were able to conquer the Ashanti. Right, we take it to the next question. What advantage did the British have over the Ashanti forces? What advantage did the British have over the Ashanti forces? For one and obvious reason, we understand that the British, they were now armed with weapons. They had advanced weapons. That is why they were able to defeat. So the reason is that they were armed with weapons. So because of them being armed with those modern weapons, they were able now to effectively attack and defeat the Ashanti who were using ineffective weapons, traditional weapons, which were ineffective compared to the modern weapons by the British. So because of that reason, they were defeated. They had an upper hand, they had an advantage. The British were having an advantage over the Ashanti because they were able to use such weapons to defeat them. Mention the two results of British colonization of the Gold Coast. How was the Gold Coast affected by the British colonization? For one reason, we are saying they lost their independence. The Ashanti lost its independence. And besides losing their independence, they also lost most of their gold. Their gold treasures were taken. And the people were forced to work for very low wages. That's the idea of the losses that were incurred. We can talk of other losses, like they lost their land. They also lost their freedom. Remember, the British were imposing new laws and regulations on the Ashanti people. So they lost their freedom and also they lost their independence. They lost their gold treasures. Remember, it was very rich in gold resources, and those gold resources were the target by the British. They extracted as much as they could to their own benefit at the expense of the Ashanti people. Right. In a paragraph of about 8 lines, discuss the results of colonization of the African continent. When you're assessing this question here, when you're looking at the results of colonization, we want to look at it from the perspective which is positive and the perspective which is negative. The positive perspective and the negative perspective in this instance, because the question is saying discuss the results of colonization on African continent. It can be negative, it can be positive, because colonization brought both positive and negative results. So in our paragraph, I'll just, you write as a paragraph, remember, you write continuously, but for the sake of this discussion, I will split the ideas into the side of negatives and the side of positives, right? So I'm going to look at the negatives first, and then I'll also try to look at the positives. On the side of negatives, we are saying Africans, they were not happy with colonialism. It brought with itself negative results or disastrous results on the people. Like, we are talking about loss of independence of African states. Africans were losers at the end. They lost their independence. They lost their freedom. And then we can also look at loss of Africa's natural resources, like mineral resources, wildlife was lost. Then you can also look at loss of land. Because of colonialism, Africans lost their land. They could no longer do their day-to-day activities. Their lives were disturbed by the colonialists. And also the negative results, we can look at other aspects like the Africans in this instance. We can say the Africans on the side of the negatives, we can say the Africans lost their freedom. Freedom was lost on the side of Africans. We can also look at the other losses on the side of Africans, like issues like slavery, forced labor. They were brought by the colonialists. Because of colonialism, they were able to manipulate and enslave the Africans in their own very homeland. So it was a negative result. Then you can also look at the idea of the colonists bringing in artificial borders. Artificial borders, which now restricted the free movement of Africans. Remember, Africans were moving freely across the regions. Wherever they wanted to migrate, they would migrate. But now, because of the artificial borders, they were now restricted. They could no longer move freely as what they used to do before the coming of the colonists. So you are looking at it from the perspective of the negatives. Or you can also look at loss of cultural identity. Africans lost their cultural identity because of colonialism. They were now adopting cultures of the colonialists. So it was not a good thing to lose your culture because of someone who has just came to your country and invaded over and imposed their culture on you. So it was also a negative implication on the African societies. But that besides the point, you can also look at it from a perspective of the positive. We can say Africans were civilized. Colonialism brought civilization. Civilization was brought because of colonialism. We became civilized. And also we can talk of the benefits of modern education, which is now the formal one. Instead of us adopting the oral tradition form of education, we are now having formal education where we attend school and learn. It's also a positive implication that was brought in by colonialism. And also we can look at industrialization. The colonists, they brought the idea of industrialization, which is a benefit to Africans. Now Africa is industrialized. And also we can look at technology. Africans benefited because of the coming of technology, which was brought in by the coming of the colonialists. So we cannot exhaust everything, but that is the picture behind. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question is question number 4, which is based on the countries that fought each other in World War I. That is the focus of our question. Right. In which year did World War I begin? We understand that World War I, it began in 1914. That was the year, like what is indicated here. He's saying 1914 to 1918, Common Era. So it's 1914. That was when the World War began. First World War. How many years did the war last? The war lasted between the range of 1914 to 1918. How many years are in between from 1914 to 1918? We are saying it started from 1914 and it ended in 1918. So the question is, how many years are in this range of years here? We can safely say that the year lasted for the 4 years. Right. Then moving on to the next question. Our next question is saying, name 2 countries. Name 2 countries that formed the Allied powers at the beginning. In this instance, we are focusing on the beginning, at the beginning of the war. At the beginning. We understand that countries, they grouped themselves so that they would defend each other's interests in the event of attack by an enemy. But we are focusing here, this question wants us to identify the very first countries that were the members of the Allied powers. Right, so we are seeing that we can check from the map and also see which countries were part of the Allied powers. Like you see the color code green is representing the Allied countries. You can figure them out from there. There is this one here is in green, this is Russia. There is France, which is also in green. Then there's Italy, which is also in green. And all other countries The United Kingdom is there, and Portugal is also part of the Allied. And also, if we see, we have other countries like Greece is also, we have Romania is also, all these countries, they were part of the Allied. But the question is saying, two countries that formed the Allied powers at the beginning of the war. We know that other countries, they joined on later, affiliating themselves to the Allied powers, but we want the major countries that formed the Allied powers at the beginning of the war. The Allied powers were made up of Britain. It was the British, and then the British were also having the support of France, and we're also having the support of Italy, and also the support of Russia. Any of those. Then the next one says, name two countries that formed the Central Powers. The Central Powers we can see here, name any two countries, they are in red, according to our key. So we are figuring out these countries in red. For example, Germany, Austria-Hungary. We have here, it must be Bulgaria. We have the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey. Those are members of the Central Powers. Right, so you can list them as Germany, the major one. And also you can enlist Austria-Hungary was one of the members. And also list Turkey, which is the Ottoman Empire. You can also list any other countries that you are seeing on the map. Why was it called World War? The idea of it being referred to as a world war. What was the idea behind it being referred to as a world war? Right. The idea of the war being regarded as a world war is because the colonies of both Allied and Central Powers also took part in the war. Right, we understand that countries were colonized way before the First World War. We're talking of 1914 here, and we've been talking about the Berlin Conference of 18. So it means that time countries had agreed on how to split Africa, and now they were having colonies in Africa and in other parts of the world. And we are now seeing that there's a dispute in Europe involving European powers. And those European powers are having colonies across the world. So it meant that whatever was happening in the colonial master was also going to affect the colony. So countries in Africa, they also got involved in the world war because they were supporting their colonial masters. They were also actively involved in the support of their colonial masters. That is why it later on became a world crisis. It was a world issue because of colonialism. The colonies, they were in support of their colonial masters who were involved in a dispute in Europe, and hence it became a world crisis, a world issue. It became a world war. Right. Let's go and look at the aspects and experiences in World War I. It talks about propaganda, and we are seeing this is an anti-German propaganda poster used in the US. Destroy this made brute, enlist. And we are seeing that there is a gorilla who is ultimately in his hand or her hand. We don't know if it's a female or male gorilla having a white woman. Right. So the first question is saying define the word propaganda. When we are defining propaganda, we define it clearly as it is misleading, or we can say it's biased information. Used to promote a political point of view or cause. We want to promote a political point of view and we want the people to believe in us. Then we use propaganda. We give them false information or misleading information or information which is one-sided, which is biased. For that sake, we want people to believe in a given direction and to behave in a given direction. We must give them information that is biased, or we must give them information which is misleading to make them believe in what we want them to believe in. So that is a propaganda. Then in Britain during World War I, for what were propaganda posters used? Mention any three. Why were propaganda used? Why were propaganda posters used in Britain? What was the purpose of the British using propaganda posters? Right. They wanted to portray an image that German was evil. They wanted the British people to view Germany as a very evil country. So they were using those posters to portray Germany as an evil state. And also they wanted to give the view that men had to fight. For the good. The British were encouraged to fight for the good of their own country. And also they were using propaganda posters to portray the image that men were supposed to protect women. Men were to protect women. Or they were also using those posters to encourage men to enlist, or can say to join the military. They wanted to win the war against Germany, so they wanted encouraging the British men to join the army, to enlist in the army. So they were using propaganda, so it's a way of encouraging the British men to join the army and defeat Germany. Right. How has Germany been portrayed in this poster? We are saying, what is the portrayal of Germany in this? This is the German state. How has it been portrayed? How has it been portrayed in that? We can say the portrayal there is that of a gorilla. And we understand that a gorilla is not a friendly animal. It's something which is ultimately bad. So by painting Germany as a gorilla, they were trying to give the impression that Germany was a very bad state, was not a friend to associate with, was evil. And is portrayed as a mad brute. So if you check there, they are trying to give an image which is bad about Germany. Then the next question is saying, who do you think the woman represents? And explain your answer. Who do you think the woman represents? Explain your answer. Right. So if you are checking here, we are seeing that there's a woman in the hands of the gorilla. And who is this woman here who had been taken by the gorilla? You see, this is a white woman, and the gorilla looks to be very evil and very bad. Who is that woman? So the woman here is in the portrayal of the Allied powers. Is in the portrayal of the Allied powers, whoever member of the Allied powers was portrayed by the woman. And what's the explanation? How can we justify that the woman is being portrayed, is the portrayal of the woman is the Allied powers? We say the woman had been abducted. And it's an allegorical figure led liberty. So if we check here, we are seeing the idea here that is being tried to be highlighted by the Allied powers. They are portraying a woman being captured or being abducted by the gorilla. The same way they were giving propaganda to their very people that they must be able to fight against evil to attain the good. So it implied that that woman figure, if the British people could not fight, or the Allied powers could not fight against the evils of Germany, they were going to be abducted, the same way the woman is portrayed. So it means it was a way of showing that they were at risk from being abducted by Germany. Germany was going to take over if they did not fight. But that was propaganda. They wanted just to encourage the men to fight against Germany. They wanted to give a bad impression about Germany, that the Germans were targeting to abduct whoever was weak, and whoever was not fighting against was going to fall prey to the gorilla. Right. Then let's look at women in Britain during World War I. Source 4D is about a campaign on women in Britain during World War I. Right. Who was Emmeline Pankhurst? That's the first question. Emmeline Pankhurst. Who was Emmeline Pankhurst? Right. The question here is referring to this figure that we are seeing on the source. The figure that we see on the source is representing Emmeline Pankhurst, and it says deeds, not words. So who was she, this lady who was regarded as Emmeline Pankhurst? Right. This lady, if you are seeing her, you are seeing that she is a leader. Like you are seeing the figure as it is portrayed here. She is ahead of a large crowd of women. So by that fact, we can say she was a leader. She was a leader fighting for women. Women suffragettes. In Britain. That's basically the idea of the figure of Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a leader fighting for women suffragettes in Britain. Then the next question is saying, what was Emmeline trying to ensure for women in Britain? What was she trying to ensure about the women in Britain? So what she was trying to ensure here, she was trying to ensure that women are treated fairly. She wanted to attain the fact that women were to be treated fairly and also had the right to vote. That was the main idea of what she was fighting for. She wanted women to be treated fairly, and also they wanted to be afforded a right to vote. Because remember, during the World War I, there was a change in the roles of women. Women were now doing the jobs that were done by men because men had gone to war. So they wanted women to be treated fairly, and also they wanted the women to be granted the right to vote. Then what did her campaign aim to get for the rights of women? Rights for women. They wanted to attain equal rights. The campaign was targeting for equality, for equal rights. As men, women were supposed to be treated equally, the same way men were treated. So for that reason, we are seeing that they were supposed to be granted the rights as the same rights that were granted to men. Then number 4.3.4, what made the suffragette movement, which started off peacefully, to become more militant? We are seeing that the suffragette movement, it was a peaceful force which was advocating for equality and rights to vote. It was doing its activities in a peaceful way, but later on it became more militant, meaning to say it started using violent means to forward its cause. What made them change from being a peaceful movement to become a militant movement? That is the question. Right. The reason here is they did it in order to raise awareness and ensure that action is taken. So they were now using forceful means to ensure that the action was taken of giving rights to women and also of giving equality and fair treatment to women. So it was a way of raising awareness. They wanted everyone to know. By being militant, by using forceful and violent means, they wanted to spread their ideas across. And also they wanted to ensure that action was taken by the government to grant what they were asking for. Right. Then the next question is saying, which law was Emmeline often jailed for disobeying? She was often jailed for disobeying the British laws of the land. The laws of the land. That was what she was frequently jailed for. Right, that takes us to question 5. Question 5 is an essay question, which is a choice question. You can choose either question 5.1 or you can choose question 5.2. We're just going to highlight the 2 questions in as brief as is possible. Right. The first question is about experiences the soldiers faced during the war in the trenches. It's focused on discussing the experiences the soldiers faced during the war in the trenches. Our question here is more specific. It wants the experience of soldiers in the trenches, not in general the experiences of a war. Do not just write general experiences of a war situation. Write specific experiences to trench warfare. Because remember, much of the fighting was done in the trenches. So what typical experiences were faced by the soldiers when they were engaged in the trench warfare? That is the idea behind the question. So you must address the idea of a trench warfare to figure out how the soldiers are faced difficult conditions in trench warfare. So you focus on ideas of the trench warfare, like we are supposed to create your own introduction. Remember, this is continuous writing. You write your introduction. You can introduce your essay by talking about the First World War. What was it? How did it come into existence? Then that can be your introduction for the discussion. Then from the introduction there, you go to address the aspects of the experiences of the soldiers. How the soldiers fought. Right, we understand that the soldiers were fighting from trenches. So they lived and fought from trenches. The trenches dug into the ground. So we understand the situation here. Soldiers are fighting from trenches which are dug into the ground. It was a way of trying to avoid getting shot. They will just be exposing themselves to find an aim, but the whole body will be inside the trench. So we are imagining soldiers fighting from digging from a trench. How was the experience like? Right. Those trenches, you can also describe them. They were dug parallel to each other, which means the enemy will be having their own trench parallel to yours. And those trenches, they were about 2 meters deep. That was the nature of the trenches. Then let's look at what was happening to the soldiers. There was typical conditions that were faced by the soldiers as they were trying to either defend themselves or attack from the trenches. And also, if we check, there were also barbed wires. The trenches had barbed wires. What was the purpose of those barbed wires? They were apparently trying to prevent the enemy from getting into the trench. So the trenches were fenced with barbed wire so that they would avoid instances of the enemy finding a way of sneaking into the trenches. Right. So we are seeing a situation here that soldiers are fighting in the trenches, and those trenches were as deep as around 2 meters, and also they were fenced off by barbed wires. What was the typical conditions? The soldiers experienced horrible conditions. Now we want to see the conditions. Soldiers experienced horrible conditions in the trenches. They had to stay in the trenches for months. Remember, this is not a nice place to be in. You are in a digging as if you're an animal, and you are going to stay there for months. There was no opportunity for good life, for basic life. They were just fighting day and night in the trenches, staying there in the trenches. They could not leave. They would stay for months in the trenches. And what was the problem? The soldiers got wet and muddy. Remember, if it would rain, you are in a digging, water will collect from the bottom of the trench, and you're supposed to operate from the very bottom of the trench again. You will get very wet and you'll get very muddy in those trenches. So it was one of the challenges that the soldiers faced. They became very wet, and also they got to accumulate mud in the trenches. Because of that, most of the soldiers, they became sick. It was a horrible experience. Soldiers became sick in the trenches because of the excess cold conditions and the wetness and also the muddy conditions. They became sick in the trenches because of the prevailing conditions. What would happen? Dead soldiers. The dead soldier bodies were dragged in the trenches. And left unburied. So we are seeing a situation here. Some soldiers are dying, and in the process, the dead bodies are supposed to just be dragged. If the soldier was shot in the no man's land, the body was supposed to be taken into the trench, and the body was just supposed to stay there and buried, which means that there was now infusion of dead bodies and the living. It was a difficult situation. You can see the picture. And also because of the muddy conditions and the sicknesses, some soldiers developed wounds. And if you develop a wound and you are staying near muddy and wet conditions, it means the wound will develop some infections. It will become infected. And many of the soldiers, they died because of those infections. They died of those wound infections. Because remember, there was no treatment. And also imagine the situation, we are living with dead bodies. You are also sick. The smell in the trenches, it's very muddy, it's very dirty, it's wet. And also we are seeing a situation of the issue of rats. There were many rats there feasting on dead bodies. And also they were having lice on their bodies because they were not bathing. And also other pets in the trenches, which means it was now survival of the fittest. You would stay with any kind of creature in the trenches. The creatures would be lured, would be attracted into the trenches by the dead bodies. They will feast on the dead bodies, the rats. And then you're supposed to stay again with the same dead bodies in the muddy conditions and also in the wet conditions of the trenches. And also you look at the soldiers being exposed to harsh weather conditions. For example, during rain days, it would rain over their bodies. Cold nights, it will be cold over their bodies in the trenches. So it was very difficult for an average soldier to survive. And also there was the development of they developed what was called the trench foot. What was it? This was typical of a problem which was caused by having to stand in the mud for long periods. Standing in the mud for long, they developed a problem which was called the trench foot. It was ultimately a health problem. You stand in the mud for long, for days, for months, then you develop the problem of the trench foot. It was also another typical problem. Then you can imagine that was the nature of the conditions that the soldiers were exposed to as they were fighting from the trenches. So with that, then you can come to your conclusion. You come to sum up your argument. You wind up your discussion, or you reaffirm your points to show that the soldiers, they were ultimately exposed to very harsh and unconducive and uninhabitable conditions while he's performing their duties in the trenches. You give a tie-up conclusion of your discussion. You highlight maybe some of the key factors that you discussed in the presentation and in the essay, so that you give a summative conclusion of your discussion at the end. So basically, that's the idea of how you address such a question. Do not generalize, like you give general conditions of an ordinary war situation. This was a unique war situation of the trench warfare. Remember, most of the battles which are being fought now, they are no longer trench warfare battles. So when you're answering this question, be specific to the trench warfare, because the question wants you to figure out the conditions that were faced by the soldiers in the trenches, not outside. That is why our focus was mainly on the trenches. we were trying to figure out how life was like for the average soldier in the trenches. Let's analyze also question 5.2. In an essay of about 1 page, explain the reasons that led to the outbreak of World War I. The reasons that led to the outbreak of World War I. Right? Again, you need your introduction where you talk about the World War. You introduce the idea of the first of the World War. Then we need to focus on the reasons here. We need to focus on the reasons for the outbreak of Cold War. I will split my reasons into long-term reasons, and then we have the short-term or the immediate cause, which is one. So our long-term causes, there are many of them. There were quite a number of long-term reasons why the First World War got to exist. Right. So you look at ideas like nationalisms in Europe. Nationalisms in Europe, how did it contribute towards the tension in Europe and how it ultimately facilitated the outbreak of the First World War? You look at how European countries were competing with one another. European countries competing with one another to be the best. People in Europe they developed the sense of nationalism. They were nationalistic, which meant that they were attached so much to their countries. They loved their countries so much, and they wanted to see their countries prospering. And they wanted to see their countries being the best in terms of the level of general development and also in terms of unity, in terms of acquisition of colonies across the world. So that further widened the rift between European countries because of nationalistic ideas. Individuals were attached to their very own country, and that led to tension because of competition among its European countries. You can explain that as an idea. Then, besides that, you can also explain the idea of the colonialism. It was also part of the causes of the First World War. The idea of countries getting colonies across Africa, it further increased the tension among its European countries. Because of acquisition of colonies, countries in Europe, they were competing also to get colonies. And in that way, countries started to develop some form of tension from one another because of the effect of the acquisition of territories across the divide of the world countries that were being captured and being controlled and influenced by those European countries. Then you can also explain the ideas of military developments. And you can relate that to industrialization. Right, we start with industrialization. Countries in Europe were industrialized. And for that sake, because of industrialization, countries were also seeking to develop their economies to become the best. So for the sake of industrialization, countries were also competing to become the most industrialized. And for that reason, it's also a factor that contributed towards tension in Europe. Each and every country was targeting to be the best industrialized country. They were competing in terms of the level of industrialization. Remember, it was the British who started with industrialization, where we talk about the Industrial Revolution, where they changed the economies from being an agrarian economy to a manufacturing economy. And other countries, they also followed. So for the same reason, it was also a factor that promoted drift in Europe. And we have the idea of military developments. Because of industrialization, we are seeing that European countries were able to develop weapons. And they were able to come out with weapons of mass destruction. For example, you talk of the nuclear age, the nuclear weapons. Because of industrialization, they were now able to come out with new ideas of producing better weapons and more destructive weapons. So with a weapon in the hand, the only way is to find an enemy to attack and test the power and effectiveness of the weapons. So them being armed, it also made that it was a factor that favored the development of wars. Then also we have the talk of the control of the seas and also the trade routes. There was also competition on the control of the seas and control of the trade routes, which were profitable. That also further widened the tension in Europe. Countries were competing with one another to control the sea and also to control the major trade routes. And that led to widespread tension amongst the European countries. Right. So those are some of the long-term causes. Then you go on to look at the immediate cause. The immediate cause is the Sarajevo assassination of the Austrian heir who was Archduke Franz Ferdinand by an 18-year-old Serbian, Gavrilo Princip. Right. You explained the events that happened in the Balkans. In the Balkan region, we understand that the small states in the Balkan region, which is part of the East Europe, they were controlled or they were under the influence of Austria. And for the very same reason, they wanted their independence. They did not want to be controlled by Austria. And we understand that there was an instance of the Austrian heir, Archduke Ferdinand, who was inspecting the army in Serbia and apparently was assassinated in the process by a Serb, 18-year-old Gavrilo Princip. And for that reason, it widened the tension in Europe because the Austrians were not happy with what the Serbians had done. And also, the Serbians had got their support from Russia. And for that reason, we see that it developed into a crisis because of countries were aligned now to one another. And it also meant that an attack on one was meaning an attack on all in the group. So for that reason, we also see that that was the immediate cause of the First World War. The event that happened in Sarajevo in the Balkan region, where there was assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, who was Archduke Ferdinand. Right. So basically, those are the ideas that you use to explain and write your essay on the causes of the First World War. And then you come out to your conclusion where you tie up your argument, you give a summative end to your discussion. Then that becomes a complete essay. You would have done justice and you would have effectively addressed the question. Right. So basically, that is the idea behind how we can answer the questions, how we can attempt to give responses to the given set of questions as per the paper. Right. So that was our history paper for grade 8. And with that being said and done, I think we are done with this discussion. We have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you for watching till we meet again in other discussions to follow.